on to another type of light source, we have what are called continuous lights. So they're lights like these right here that are on all the time. Instead of flashes that just flash and they're done, these are continuous. You have hot lights or tungsten fixtures, and they're called that because they do get hot. As you put power into them, the more powerful they are, the more heat they generate. A little bit after that, a company called KinoFlow became very popular for creating fluorescent fixtures that were actually suitable for doing film and video. Originally, fluorescent fixtures would flicker. They had this, they called it the green spike in the spectrum, like it had this green tone to it. But KinoFlow kind of perfected lights that were color accurate and didn't flicker. And we've moved on from there to LED lights, which are not hot at all, which is great. They don't generate a lot of heat. But what all of these things have in common is that it takes a lot of energy to create a big light source. Even these LEDs and these lights over here are called sky panels, and they're tremendously expensive because there's a lot of science that's gone into creating a light that's this size, where the entire thing is a light source. It's usually a lot easier and more efficient for us to take a small source, like one of these, and then bounce it or diffuse it. Now, these lights are really great and they're gorgeous, and if I had the budget, I would go with these because it's a large light source that then can be made even larger with larger diffusion like we've done here. But the idea is that with constant light sources, you're drawing a lot of power for the same amount of power that you would get in a strobe, and we'll talk about why in a second. So we come to strobes, and there are a few different types of strobes that are popular. Over here we have what are called speed lights, and I believe that's a Nikon term, but everyone calls this kind of hot shoe flash that you put on your camera, or you can use off your camera, a speed light. Strobes don't generate a lot of heat. They freeze motion, which is unique to them. If you have a continuous light source, you need to get a lot of light to be able to have your shutter speed low. On the other hand, flashes, because of the way they work, you're going to freeze motion kind of automatically. The way that all flashes work is that there is a capacitor inside them. And what that means is that they take in energy slowly and build it up and then release it really quickly. I have not found a better, easily accessible metaphor for this. If anyone has any ideas afterwards, please let me know. But it's like a toilet, right? The tank fills up slowly and then you flush and all of it rushes out at once. That's kind of the same principle of a capacitor and a flash. Over here we have kind of an in-between thing called a Q flash. Again, that's the one brand name, but everyone kind of groups that size of flash into the same category. A little bit larger than the speed lights, and they plug into an external power pack. So one of the things that the power pack gives is that it gives you a faster recycle time, and that means the time between flashes. With this, you might be stuck, especially if the battery is low, waiting a few seconds for that flash to come back up to power to actually release again. This buys you a little bit faster time because it's an external power source. Moving along here, we have Power Pack Studio Strobes. Now, what the Power Pack is the capacitor itself. So over here, we have the power source and the capacitor and this big brick down here. And you can see it's really heavy, and this is a pretty powerful light. And then the light itself is separate, and that's connected to the Power Pack. So you need the power pack in order to power the light. And then down on the far end here, we have what are called monoblocks or monolights. And these actually have the capacitor inside it. So this whole unit just plugs into the wall. One of the things that's good about these is if you have it on a boom like this, it's lighter. So you don't have a whole lot of weight holding this down. You don't have a whole lot of weight hanging over like a model's head and it could fall and hurt them. This is a lot heavier, so it puts a lot more weight up there. On the other hand, especially older power packs have this thing called power distribution. And when you get over here, you can look at all these dials, but there's all these combinations that you have to do to get the certain amount of power out of each strobe. So it's kind of set in rigid like fractions of the total amount of power that the pack can generate. Whereas if you have more than one monolight, you just dial in each monolight's power and then you get what you get. So this is actually, it's from f-stoppers. This is an example of how flash can freeze motion. So the characteristics of all strobes, like I mentioned, they all have a capacitor, slow intake of energy, rapid release of energy. They let you draw less power from the wall because that energy is coming in slowly and then being released quickly. They all have a power control or a variator. On these monolights, it's pretty simple. It's just one dial here in the center. You dial up or down. The variators on older strobe packs, like I said, you have to dial in the right combination to get the right amount of power output from your strobes. And the term that you'll hear to measure power on strobes is watt seconds. Technically, the watt second is the energy equivalent to the power of 1 watt sustained at 1 second. So if you have 1 watt of power over 1 second, and you take that and you crunch it down into, say, like 1/100th of a second, 1,000th of a second, that's the amount of power that you're putting through at that time. So you can see how really quickly you can get an exposure that's much brighter from a strobe than you would from a continuous light, because it's forcing all that energy out very rapidly. They freeze motion. In here today, we might have a little bit of issue with that because there's so much ambient light in here. If we really wanted to freeze motion, we would probably need to put curtains or black out the windows somehow, because there is just a little bit of ambient light that's leaking into the photos I was noticing I was taking earlier with the strobes. And then most have what are called modeling lights, and that's actually what's on right now on this strobe. So you can see how this strobe is lit up, and then once we fire it, the flash actually fires. What that light allows you to do is to get your direction correct. So you can use that light to say, okay, I'm looking at this and I can see here's the nose shadow, and I can see here's the chin shadow. I want to put it here to get this sort of effect. On some strobes, the modeling light will actually turn off and turn back on to let you know that it's flashed. But that's the primary use of modeling lights. They're not very good for judging ratios just because they're approximate. And the ratio of flash power is usually pretty hard to create an equivalent with the modeling lights. So you might get close, with the modeling lights as far as ratio or how much light you have coming from each light, but generally modeling lights are better for figuring out the direction of your light rather than the quantity. So I mentioned power packs. So this is kind of a smaller set of Profoto lights called the Acute. And there's basically 3 switches, which you can kind of see here. And these are all the possible combinations that you would have to enter in to get that sort of power out of 3 strobes or 2 strobes. It's pretty complicated, which is why I don't like these Acute packs and why I personally really like the monolights, because I can just dial each one in and be there, as opposed to, oh my gosh, like is I flipping the asymmetrical button, or am I flipping this button? Or it drives me crazy. So I just stick to monolights, because they just have you dial in right there. To that end, also, I've kind of mentioned this before, but one big tip I have is never do a high stakes shoot with equipment you're unfamiliar with. And by high stakes, I mean you're being paid. That's kind of high stakes because you need to actually produce what you're being paid to produce. Or even if you're not getting paid, if you're trying to impress an agent that you're shooting models for, or you're shooting a wedding that's kind of hard to redo, then make sure you know your equipment ahead of time. We're not going to go over a lot of the technical intricacies of this is how you plug in a light, this is how you set this up, this is how you use this dial. The reason why I don't want to cover that is because it's pretty easy if you just want to take something home and look at the manual and kind of go through it and learn it that way. So I just mentioned syncing strobes to your camera. So the flash needs to know exactly when to fire so that it is firing while the shutter is opening and closing on your camera. So the way that we do that is we have either a sync cable or we have a wireless trigger. So yeah, this is a wireless trigger. It's called a Pocket Wizard. ProPhoto has their own version of it, which is an air remote. So the advantage of the air remote is that with other air models of ProPhoto equipment, you can actually use this to adjust the power of the light, how strong the modeling light is. You can turn the head on and off, and you can actually program different lights to different groups. So you can say, okay, that's my A light, I want to increase that by 1 stop. My B light, I want to turn that off because I want to see what it's doing. You can do that all on the ProPhoto Air Remote. The Pocket Wizard is incredibly simple. It just fires. One thing about brands, I'm pretty brand agnostic as far as the things that I try to teach are universal to all brands, but there is something to be said for using equipment made by companies like ProPhoto and Pocket Wizard, which are kind of industry standards. There are lights by a lot of different companies. Paul C. Buff is one of them, kind of the Alien Bees, the Einsteins. They are actually pretty good lights. If you want to rent them in LA, I'm not sure where you would do that. Whereas you can rent and try out a lot of this equipment because everyone has it. This is what they stock here at Apex. Sammy's Camera, which is probably the biggest camera and still rental house in LA, carries a lot of ProPhoto. They also carry brands like Elinchrom and Dynalite, which are pretty universal. If you have a brand that's not one of these, where they're kind of available everywhere, something breaks or you don't have something you need, it's harder to go get it on that same day. Whereas, it's like, oh gosh, I don't have, the correct modifier for this. I just call up Sammy's, I can probably have it here in 30 minutes, that sort of thing. And also, if you learn on one type of lighting, there are certain things that are universal, but you kind of develop your favorites, and ProPhoto is my favorite for strobe lighting. But like I said, Elinchrom is another great brand, and so is Dynalite. Dynalite's kind of claim to fame is they have very small power packs and very small heads, so they're very lightweight. ProPhoto's big thing, which I think is patented because I've never seen anyone else do this, but you notice on here, your reflectors and modifiers actually can be moved forward or back, and that can change the type of light. So you're kind of either spotting the light and making it smaller, or what's called flooding it, you're making the light bigger. And all of their modifiers have this system on it. And it's also really easy. Some, I'm again thinking of kind of the Alien Bees ones. To attach a modifier, you need to hold this thing down, and then there are 4 clamps that have to fit into all 4 sides of the reflector, and then you release it, and then you kind of see if it actually caught all 4, and if it didn't, you have to go back. This is really easy. You just slip it on and tighten it down, and it's done. So I don't work for ProPhoto. I don't get paid by ProPhoto, but I consistently have used ProPhoto over the years, and I've been very happy with it. Do I ever use strobe and continuous light at the same time? I have used strobe and daylight at the same time. I haven't. I think there have been some instances where I needed like a fill light or something. I didn't have anything available, so I used a continuous light. Trying to get kind of the world of power of strobes and continuous lights that's not the sun into the same kind of playing field, where strobe, the power is up here, and then continuous lights are kind of down here. Trying to find that overlap where the strobe won't blow out the exposure, but then at the same time the continuous light will actually have an effect. That's a little tricky, but it can be done. Daylight is so powerful on its own that it's usually easier to mix daylight and strobe. So yes, I've done it. There's also the question of color temperature. If you're using a tungsten light, like one of the Fresnels I showed you, like that's the kind of, it was just called tungsten, but it's a very orange light compared to these, which are closer to daylight, which is much bluer. So that might also be an issue if you have a continuous light that's not the same color temperature as your strobe. So mixing those might cause some issues. Does that make sense? Cool. One other technical thing we should talk about is sync speed. And if you are shooting faster than your sync speed, you will get a picture that looks like this. What do I mean by that? So each camera has a maximum shutter speed, usually around 1/200th or 1/250th of a second, that it will sync to a flash. And that means that the shutter will be able to open and close. There's two curtains, so one opens, one closes, and have that flash land somewhere in the middle when the sensor is completely exposed. If you shoot faster than that, you get this. You get the second shutter starting to close and cutting off part of your photo. I've noticed that certain cameras, and especially the Canons, I don't trust what their published sync speeds are. I think this is supposed to be 250, but I still get a little bit of a dark line at the edge. So on the Canons, I'll usually shoot like 1/200th or 1/160th. It's usually also good to try to stay as close to the sync speed if you don't want the ambient light to be affecting your exposure of a strobe. The slower your shutter speed is, the more that continuous light sources like window light or even lights from just your environment will make an impact on the image. In general, when you're working with strobe in a lit environment, your aperture controls how much power the strobe has, and then your shutter speed controls how much power the ambient or continuous light around you has. So that's one way in which you can mix strobe with daylight, is if you're in here and you want to fill some more light in, you might want to decrease the shutter speed so that the ambient light gets up a little bit more, whereas the strobe light stays the same by not varying the aperture.